in a crumbling tower, veiled in mist, where the air itself seems to whisper secrets of ages past, Kael, a young sorcerer with a thirst for knowledge, stumbles upon something he was never meant to find. It's an ancient tome, its cover bound in chains that seem to pulse with a life of their own. Warnings are etched into its pages, words that scream to be left untouched. But Kael's curiosity burns brighter than his fear. As he opens the book, a surge of dark energy erupts, searing through the room and transforming his eyes into glowing embers. The tome begins to whisper, its voice both alluring and terrifying. It promises power beyond imagination, power that could reshape the world. Yet, as the words sink into his mind, Kael feels something else, an overwhelming sense of dread. He knows, deep in his soul, that he has crossed a line he can never uncross. The world around him shudders, as if aware of the darkness he has unleashed. And in the shadows, something stirs. The Dark Sorcerers, ancient and malevolent, have taken notice. Their presence looms closer, drawn by the forbidden magic now coursing through Kael's veins. Where are you joining us from, and what time is it there? Because this is just the beginning of a tale where every choice comes at a cost, and the line between power and peril becomes dangerously thin. Kael's breath came in ragged gasps as he burst out of the tower, the chill night air biting at his skin. Behind him, spectral wraiths surged like shadows given life, their cold, glowing eyes fixed on him. The ancient tome he had awakened pulsed in his hands, its dark energy seeping into his veins. Desperation drove him to act. With a shaky incantation, he summoned a basic fire spell, a flicker of flames that danced between him and the wraiths. But as the fire grew, so did the tome's power, surging through him in a flood of raw, uncontrollable magic. It burned hotter, wilder, threatening to consume him from within. For a moment, he teetered on the edge of destruction, his vision blurred with smoke and pain. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the wraiths dissolved into wisps of shadow, leaving him alone in the silence. Kael collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling, his skin marked with faint, glowing scars. The air around him felt heavy, charged with the remnants of his unleashed power. He stared at his hands, still crackling with dark energy, and a grim resolve settled over him. This magic, forbidden and dangerous, was now a part of him. And if he wanted to survive, he would have to master it no matter the cost. But this decision was not without consequence. As Kael rose to his feet, the whispers began. The forest seemed to carry them, soft and insidious, spreading the tale of the sorcerer who had awakened something ancient. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him, and he knew his path had been set. It was a path of isolation, of danger, and of choices that would test the very core of his being. The forbidden magic had marked him, and now he would have to face the world it would inevitably reshape. Kael stood at the edge of the Obsidian Citadel, its jagged spires rising like broken teeth against a storm-racked sky. The air here was heavy, charged with echoes of the Dark Sorcerer's reign, a time when forbidden magic reshaped the world and left scars that still bled power. He had come seeking answers, guidance, anything to help him control the ancient tome he now carried. But as he stepped into the shadow of the Citadel, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking straight into a trap. It wasn't long before he found her Selene, a rogue mage with eyes that seemed to pierce through the lies he told himself. She emerged from the ruins like a shadow given form, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "That tome you carry," she said, her gaze fixed on the leather-bound relic in his hands. "It's not a tool, it's a curse. I've seen what it does to those who try to wield it. It devours them, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." Her words struck a nerve. Kael had felt it already, the way the tome whispered to him in his darkest moments, offering power at a price he didn't fully understand. But he couldn't deny the pull it had on him, the way it made him feel invincible, even as it gnawed at his soul. Selene offered a solution. "We can destroy it," she said. "Together, but we have to act now, before it's too late." Kael hesitated, his fingers tightening around the tome as if it might vanish if he let go. Destroy it. After all, he'd sacrificed to find it. The thought felt like losing a part of himself. Their uneasy alliance began in silence, each step toward the Citadel's heart heavy with unspoken tension. Selene moved with the grace of someone who knew the ruins intimately, her every step deliberate, her eyes scanning for danger. Kael followed, torn between his fear of what lay ahead and the intoxicating allure of the tome's power. As they pressed deeper into the Citadel, the air grew colder, the shadows thicker. The guardians of this place, creatures born of the same dark magic that had once ruled here, were stirring. Kael could feel their presence, a low hum in the back of his mind that set his nerves on edge. Selene glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "Stay close," she said, "and be ready. What's coming won't be easy to face." The tension between them was palpable, a fragile thread of trust stretched to its limit. Kael knew he couldn't fully trust her, just as she clearly doubted his ability to resist the tome's pull. Yet here they were, bound by necessity, two unlikely allies standing on the brink of a battle. Neither could win alone. Deep within the ancient citadel, Kael and Selene moved cautiously, the air thick with the scent of dust and danger. Around them, stone golems stirred to life, their hollow eyes glowing with an eerie light. These weren't mere statues, they were guardians, awakened by the intruder's presence. Kael raised his hand, dark energy crackling at his fingertips. With a single burst, he shattered one of the golems into rubble, but the effort left him visibly weakened. The tome he carried, pulsing with forbidden power, demanded more from him with every spell. Selene watched him closely, her sharp instincts picking up on his growing fatigue. As they pressed forward, the Citadel's traps tested their every step. Pressure plates triggered hidden blades, and false floors threatened to plunge them into darkness. Kael's focus wavered, and in a moment of carelessness, he nearly stepped into a deadly pit. Selene lunged forward, grabbing his arm just in time. Her quick reflexes saved him, but the look in her eyes was more than just relief. It was a silent challenge. She was proving herself indispensable, and Kael knew it. Trust, reluctant but undeniable, began to form between them. Yet as they continued, Kael couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in his mind. The tome's whispers grew louder, its power seductive but suffocating. Was he truly mastering it, or was it slowly consuming him? The question hung heavy, a shadow over every decision he made. Selene, ever perceptive, noticed the conflict in his silence, but chose not to press. For now, their partnership was fragile, a delicate balance of necessity and mistrust. Finally, they stumbled upon a hidden chamber, its walls lined with ancient carvings. At its center lay a map, intricately detailed and radiating an aura of foreboding. It was a guide to the Dark Sorcerers' hidden vault, a place of unimaginable power and peril. As Kael traced the map's lines with his fingers, a spark of ambition flickered in his eyes. But Selene's gaze was wary. She knew the cost of such power, and she wondered if Kael was prepared to pay it. The tension between them simmered, unspoken but undeniable, as the weight of their discovery settled in the air. As Kael and Selene ventured deeper into the cursed forest, an oppressive stillness settled around them. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the trees themselves were alive and watching. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the forest was feeding on their unease. Strange whispers, barely audible, floated through the mist, tugging at the edges of their minds. It wasn't long before the forest began its cruel test, weaving illusions from the deepest corners of their past. Kael froze as a figure emerged from the shadows, a younger version of himself, eyes bright and untroubled, untouched by the darkness he now carried. The boy held out a hand, a silent reminder of the innocence Kael had lost. For a moment, he was paralyzed, caught between the ache to reclaim that purity and the grim reality of the power he'd embraced. The tome at his side pulsed faintly, as if mocking his hesitation. Selene, meanwhile, found herself surrounded by a scene she tried to bury. The laughter of her family filled the air, their faces vivid, their warmth so real she could almost touch it. But the vision twisted sharply, dissolving into the chaos of the night. They were taken by the Dark Sorcerers. Her heart clenched as their cries echoed in her ears, a haunting symphony of grief and regret. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to push forward, but the weight of those memories clung to her like a second shadow. As they pressed on, their paths converged, and they found themselves standing side by side in a clearing. The forest seemed to sense their vulnerability, intensifying its assault. Yet in the midst of the torment, something shifted. Kael glanced at Selene, her pain mirrored in his own eyes, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of understanding. "It's not just me, is it?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Selene met his gaze, her expression softening. "No," she replied, "it never is." Their shared pain became a fragile bridge, uniting them in a way neither had expected. But even as they drew closer, a subtle tension lingered. Kael's hand instinctively brushed the tome, a gesture Selene noticed with growing unease. She had seen the changes in him, how the book's influence seemed to seep into his every decision, how his eyes darkened with each use of its power. "Kael," she began cautiously, "you can't let it consume you." "Not like this." He looked away, his silence speaking volumes. The forest's illusions grew more desperate, testing not just their resolve, but the fragile bond they were forming. Kael wrestled with the pull of the tome, its whispers promising strength and retribution, while Selene fought to keep him grounded. Together, they navigated the twisted labyrinth of their regrets, each step a battle against the forest's malevolence. But as the path ahead grew darker, so too did the divide between them, threatening to fracture the trust they had just begun to build. As Kael and Selene approached the vault's entrance, the air grew thick with an eerie stillness. the kind that warns of danger lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and coalescing into a towering, sentient beast. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling intelligence, and its form rippled like liquid darkness. The guardian of the vault. Without hesitation, Kael stepped forward, gripping the ancient tome tightly. He began to chant, the pages glowing with a sinister light as he channeled its forbidden magic. The shadow beast let out a guttural roar, its form flickering as the dark energy weakened it, but the toll on Kael was immediate and severe. He staggered, his face pale, and blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. The tome's power was consuming him, and it was clear he couldn't sustain it much longer. Seeing Kael falter, Selene acted swiftly. Her hands crackled with energy as she summoned a bolt of lightning, pure and blinding. With a forceful motion, she hurled it at the beast, striking it square in the chest. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting shriek before dissolving into wisps of shadow. The Guardian was defeated, but the victory felt hollow. Selene turned to Kael, her expression a mix of relief and fury. "You could have died," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "Do you even realize what you're doing to yourself with that thing?" Kael wiped the blood from his lips, his eyes defiant. "It's the only way," he insisted, clutching the tome tighter. "We need its power to stop what's coming." The tension between them was palpable. Selene shook her head, her voice softer but no less urgent. "This isn't power, Kael. It's destruction. You're risking everything, your life, our mission, for something you can't even control." Kael's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice," he said coldly. Selene stared at him, her frustration giving way to something deeper: fear. Fear for him, for the path he was choosing. "If you keep using that tome," she said quietly, "I won't be able to follow you." Their eyes locked, neither willing to back down. For a moment, it felt as if the very ground between them had shifted, the foundation of their partnership cracking under the weight of their disagreement. Without another word, Kael turned and stepped into the vault, the dim light casting long shadows across his face. Selene hesitated, torn between her loyalty to their cause and her growing unease about Kael's descent into darker magic. With a heavy heart, she followed him into the unknown, the rift between them widening with every step. As Kael and Selene stepped further into the vault, their lanterns cast flickering light on a massive mural stretching across the ancient walls. The artwork tells a story, one of triumph and tragedy. Here, the Dark Sorcerers rise, their power unmatched, their influence spreading like a shadow across the land. But just as quickly, their empire crumbles, brought down by betrayal and their own insatiable hunger for power. Kael's eyes linger on the figure at the center of the mural, Voryn, their leader, whose gaze seems to follow him even in painted form. Selene's voice breaks the silence, urgent and firm. She warns Kael about the tome in his hands. It's no ordinary book. It's a prison holding Voren's soul. The Dark Sorcerer's spirit, trapped for centuries, now whispers to Kael, its voice low and seductive. Voren offers him everything he's ever wanted: power beyond measure, the ability to reshape the world, a legacy that would never be forgotten. But Selene's words cut through the temptation. She pleads with Kael to destroy the tome before it's too late, before Voren's influence takes hold. The weight of the decision presses on Kael. He can feel the promise of greatness, but also the danger of becoming nothing more than a vessel for Voren's return. His ambition wars with his fear, leaving him frozen in the moment. The air grows heavier, the whispers louder. Kael's hand tightens around the tome as he stands at the edge of a choice that could change everything. For himself, for Selene, for the world itself. As Kael stepped deeper into the ancient vault, the air grew heavier, thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to vibrate through his very soul. Suddenly, a shadowy figure materialized before him, its form shifting like smoke. It was Voryn, the Dark Sorcerer, whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest. His voice, a low, echoing growl, filled the chamber. "You've come far, Kael," Voryn taunted, "but you are not here by chance. You are the key to my return." Kael's heart raced as Voren's spirit circled him, weaving a web of temptation. Visions flooded his mind, grand halls of power, armies bowing at his feet, and a world reshaped by his will. The promise of glory was intoxicating, but it came with a darker edge. Visions of cities in flames, innocents crying out, and a shadow spreading across the land. Kael clenched his fists, trying to shake the images. "I won't be your pawn," he shouted, his voice trembling with defiance. But Voren's power was overwhelming. The Dark Sorcerer's laughter echoed as he pressed deeper into Kael's mind, weakening his resolve. Just as Kael felt himself slipping, a burst of light cut through the shadows. Selene stood at the chamber's edge, her hands glowing with arcane energy. "Not today, Voren," she cried, casting a binding spell that crackled through the air. The spell struck Voren's spirit, momentarily weakening his hold on Kael. Kael stumbled back, his body trembling as the battle for control raged within him. The pull of Voren's dark magic was like a tide, threatening to drown his humanity. Selene reached out, her voice steady but urgent. "Fight it, Kael. You are stronger than this." With a shaky breath, Kael focused on her words, drawing strength from the flicker of light still within him. Together, they fled the vault, the walls trembling as if the very earth sought to keep them prisoner. But even as they escaped, Kael could feel Voren's presence lingering in the corners of his mind, a whisper that refused to fade. The battle had only just begun, and the question loomed: could Kael resist the darkness, or would he become the very thing he sought to destroy? Kael and Selene found solace in the quiet embrace of a secluded village, far from the chaos that had plagued their journey. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the murmur of a nearby stream, offering a temporary refuge. Yet, even in this serene haven, Kael could not escape the torment within. His nightmares grew fiercer, vivid visions of shadowy figures and swirling voids that left him drenched in sweat and trembling at dawn. Worse still, strange marks began to appear on his skin, dark, vein-like tendrils that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a grim reminder of the tome's relentless grip. Selene, ever the relentless seeker of solutions, pored over ancient texts by candlelight, her fingers tracing faded symbols and cryptic incantations. She discovered a ritual, one that promised to sever the tome's connection to Kael once and for all. But the cost was steep. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, a piece of the one who performed it, be it their strength, their memory, or even their life. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily on her shoulders, a burden she carried in silence as she watched Kael withdraw further into himself. Kael, once resolute and defiant, now seemed a shadow of his former self. Self-doubt gnawed at him, and the fear of losing control to the tome's dark influence consumed his thoughts. He began to distance himself from Selene, convinced that his tainted presence would only bring her harm. Their bond, once unshakable, now teetered on the edge of fracture as Kael's inner turmoil threatened to drive them apart. Yet Selene remained steadfast, her determination unwavering even as she prepared for the ritual. She knew the path ahead would demand much from her, perhaps more than she was willing to give, but the thought of losing Kael to the darkness was unbearable. As the days passed, the air between them grew tense, a silent acknowledgement of the choices that lay ahead. Selene's resolve deepened, even as the cost of saving Kael loomed ever larger, casting a long shadow over their fragile hope. As the moon hung heavy in the night sky, Selene stepped into the circle of ancient runes, her resolve unwavering. With every ounce of her being, she began the ritual, her hands trembling as she channeled her life force into the spell. The air crackled with energy, and the ancient tome in Kael's grasp began to glow faintly. Its malevolent grip on him seemed to falter, but only for a moment. Voren's spirit, sensing the threat, surged forth like a tempest. Dark energy erupted from the tome, twisting and writhing as it spread outward, threatening to engulf the entire village. The ground trembled, and the air grew thick with malice. Kael struggled against the darkness, his mind a battlefield, memories of his past laughing with Selene, training under the old master. The quiet moments of peace flooded his thoughts. Each memory became an anchor, pulling him back from the abyss. He clung to them, refusing to let Voren's will consume him completely. Meanwhile, Selene pressed on, her determination unyielding even as her strength waned. Her voice grew faint, her movements slower, but she didn't stop. The ritual was working, though the cost was clear. Finally, with a burst of light, the tome's hold on Kael shattered. The dark energy dissipated like smoke in the wind, and the village was saved. But Selene collapsed to the ground, her breathing shallow, her face pale. Kael rushed to her side, his heart heavy with guilt and gratitude. Tears welled in his eyes as he gently cradled her in his arms, vowing silently to protect her at all costs. In that moment, he realized the true price of his ambition. The people he loved, the life he cherished, all nearly lost to his relentless pursuit of power. The weight of that realization settled over him, a solemn promise to never let darkness take hold again. As the weight of Selene's unconscious form pressed against his back, Kael pressed forward through the dense forest. His breath labored, but his resolve unshaken. The hidden sanctuary, a place whispered of only in legends, was their last hope. Its entrance was shrouded in mist, an ethereal barrier that seemed to recognize Kael's desperation and allow him passage. Inside, healers moved with quiet precision, their hands glowing with soft, restorative magic as they tended to Selene's wounds. Kael watched from the shadows, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. In that moment, the weight of his journey bore down on him like a storm. He thought of the choices he'd made, the tome, the power, the whispers of Voren that had led him astray. He had sought strength to protect those he cared for, but instead he had brought them harm. Selene's pale face, her labored breathing, was a stark reminder of the cost of his actions. Kael clenched his fists, feeling the sting of his own wounds, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. Voren's voice still lingered in his mind, a faint echo that refused to be silenced. It taunted him, tempting him to return to the path of darkness, but Kael had reached a turning point. He could no longer ignore the truth. The Dark Sorcerer's legacy was a poison, and he had been its unwitting vessel. To protect the ones he loved, he had to sever that tie completely. Determined, Kael sought out the sanctuary's mages, ancient practitioners who had long guarded the secrets of pure, untainted magic. They welcomed him, though their eyes held a cautious curiosity. Under their guidance, Kael began to train anew, learning to channel his power without the tome's corrupting influence. The process was grueling, each lesson a battle against the habits and instincts the dark magic had ingrained in him. Yet with each passing day, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that he could reclaim the light within himself. The sanctuary became more than a refuge. It was a crucible where Kael reforged his purpose. As he honed his skills, he began to see a path forward, one that didn't rely on the darkness he had once embraced. The fight ahead would be perilous, but for the first time in a long while, Kael felt ready to face it. The Dark Sorcerer's reign would end, and he would be the one to ensure it. As whispers of an unsettling gathering began to ripple through the shadows, Kael's instincts told him something dangerous was brewing. Reports of Dark Sorcerer remnants convening in secret reached his ears, their intentions shrouded in mystery, but laced with malice. Selene, now fully recovered from their last encounter with the cult, stood by his side, her sharp eyes reflecting both determination and concern. Together, they pieced together fragments of information, realizing the cult's goal was nothing short of catastrophic: the full resurrection of Voryn, the once undefeated Dark Sorcerer. Disguising themselves as initiates, Kael and Selene infiltrated the clandestine meeting, their presence undetected amidst the eerie rituals. The air was thick with dark incantations, and the cultists spoke of a celestial alignment, a rare convergence of stars that would amplify their dark magic tenfold. This alignment, they claimed, was the key to unlocking Voren's essence from its fractured prison and restoring him to power. Kael's jaw tightened as he absorbed the gravity of their plan, his resolve solidifying like tempered steel. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. Yet, as they slipped away from the gathering, Selene couldn't help but notice the weight pressing on Kael. His determination was unwavering, but there was a shadow in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The mission was taking its toll, not just physically, but emotionally. She reached out, her voice soft but steady. "Kael, I know how much this means to you, but you're not alone. Don't let this consume you." Her words lingered in the air, a reminder of the human cost of their battle against the darkness. Kael nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the celestial alignment loomed ever closer, a ticking clock they couldn't outrun. The road ahead was fraught with peril, but together they would face it, no matter the cost. As Kael and Selene moved through the shadowy corridors of the cult's stronghold, the air grew heavy with tension. Every step brought them closer to the secrets they sought, but also deeper into danger. Suddenly, a faint whisper echoed through the halls. Their presence had been detected. Before they could react, the corridor erupted into chaos as cultists emerged from the shadows, blades gleaming and spells crackling in the air. Kael raised his hand, summoning the dark magic he'd only begun to master. A swirling vortex of energy erupted around him, deflecting the incoming attacks. But the strain was immediate, his body trembling under the weight of the power. Selene stepped forward, her movements precise as she countered the cultist strikes with her sword and light-based spells. Together, they fought back to back, their synergy undeniable, yet the odds were overwhelming. Every spell Kael unleashed drained him further, but he refused to falter, knowing their survival depended on his resolve. Selene's quick thinking opened a path for them to retreat, and with the vital information in hand, they made a desperate run for the exit. But the cult's elite enforcers were already on their trail, their relentless pursuit closing in. The chase led them through twisting passages and crumbling ruins, the tension mounting with every step. Kael and Selene knew they couldn't outrun their pursuers forever. The stage was set for a final confrontation, one that would test their limits and decide the fate of their mission. The question wasn't just whether they could escape, it was whether they could survive what awaited them. As Kael and Selene stood within the sanctuary, the weight of their mission pressed heavily upon them. The air was thick with tension, but also a growing sense of resolve. They knew the cult's stronghold would not fall easily, and every ally they could rally was crucial. From the shadows of the sanctuary, warriors and mages emerged, their faces etched with determination. These were not mere fighters, they were survivors, each with their own reasons for standing against the darkness. Kael and Selene moved among them, forging a bond of unity that would become their greatest strength. Yet even as they prepared, Kael felt a familiar pull, a whisper in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. It was Voryn, his former mentor, using their lingering connection to sow doubt and fear. The cultists, sensing this vulnerability, amplified their attacks, aiming to break Kael before the battle even began. Haunted by visions of his past and the power he once wielded, Kael teetered on the edge of despair. But Selene was there, her presence a steady anchor in the storm. She reminded him of who he was, not the vessel of darkness Voryn had tried to make him, but a beacon of hope for those who had lost everything. Her words cut through the fog of his mind, reigniting the fire within him. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the allies stood ready, their eyes fixed on the towering fortress of the cult. The siege was about to begin, and Kael stepped forward, not just as a warrior, but as a leader. His voice carried across the gathered forces, firm and unwavering. "This is not just a battle for our survival," he declared, "but for the soul of our world. We fight not out of vengeance, but for the future we believe in." The words resonated deeply, rallying the hearts of those who had once felt lost. Selene stood beside him, her magic shimmering like a protective veil. Together, they represented something far greater than themselves, a union of strength and compassion, of light piercing through the shadows. As the first wave of their forces advanced, Kael's determination burned brighter than ever. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with peril, but he also knew this was the moment to end Voren's threat, once and for all. The battle for the stronghold had begun, and with it, the final chapter of their journey. The air crackled with raw energy as Kael stood face to face with the cult's leaders, their eyes gleaming with malice. Sparks of dark magic erupted around them, each strike a test of willpower and control. Kael's hands trembled as he channeled the forbidden power within him, feeling its seductive pull, its whispers urging him to surrender to its depths. But he clenched his jaw, refusing to let it consume him. This was his fight, his choice, and he would not become what he sought to destroy. Every spell he cast was a battle not just against his enemies, but against the shadows clawing at his soul. Nearby, Selene moved like a storm, her blade slicing through the chaos with precision. Her focus never wavered from Kael, her every action driven by an unspoken vow to protect him. She was his shield, his anchor, and in her, he found the strength to keep going. Their bond, forged in fire and defiance, became a rallying cry for their allies. As the battle raged, the sight of their unyielding determination lit a spark of hope in the hearts of those who fought alongside them. Together, they were more than warriors. They were a symbol of resistance against the darkness closing in. The tide began to shift as Kael's forces pushed forward, their unity and resolve turning the chaos into momentum. Yet, just as victory seemed within reach, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the battlefield, and the air grew heavy with dread. Voren's resurrection had begun. A swirling vortex of dark energy erupted from the earth, tearing through the sky like a living nightmare. The cultists chanted louder, their voices a cacophony of madness, as the ancient sorcerer's form began to materialize. Chaos reigned, and the fragile hope they had fought so hard to ignite flickered in the face of this new, unimaginable threat. Voren's presence loomed like a storm, his power crackling through the air, suffocating and immense. Kael stood alone, the weight of the ancient tome heavy in his hands. Its pages whispered secrets of the ancients, a key to sever the tether that bound them, a connection forged in shadows and blood. Voren's voice sliced through the silence, cold and mocking, as he offered Kael one final choice: to embrace the darkness and wield its limitless power. The temptation was real, a pull that threatened to unravel Kael's resolve, but he hesitated only for a moment. Instead of yielding, Kael thought of Selene, her unwavering faith in him, the quiet strength she'd always shown. He remembered the sacrifices of his allies, the bonds they'd forged through trials and trust. Their faces flashed in his mind, a reminder of what he fought for. "No," he said, his voice steady, defiance burning in his eyes. "I won't become what you are." Voren's laughter was sharp, a sound that echoed with malice. "Then you'll fall," he snarled, his form shifting into something monstrous, a shadow given shape. The ground trembled as their wills collided, a battle not just of magic, but of conviction. Kael's humanity was his weapon, a fragile, flickering light against the crushing darkness. Each strike was a test, each moment a struggle to hold on to what made him who he was. The tome in his hands surged with energy, its power intertwining with his own. Kael channeled it, not to destroy, but to sever, to break the chain that bound him to Voren. The air around them crackled with force, reality itself seeming to strain under the pressure. It was a clash of opposites, light against shadow, hope against despair. And in that pivotal moment, Kael found his strength not in power, but in the connections that made him whole. The The moment Kael's hands closed around the ancient tome, a surge of raw, chaotic energy pulsed through his veins. It was as if the book itself was alive, fighting back with every fiber of its dark essence. But Kael's resolve was unshakable. With a final, desperate cry, he channeled all his strength into destroying the tome, severing Voren's tether to the mortal world. The explosion that followed was blinding, a cataclysmic burst of light and shadow that shook the very foundations of the cult's stronghold. Kael was thrown back, his body racked with pain, yet somehow he clung to life. The air was thick with the scent of charred parchment and ash, and as the dust settled, the once imposing fortress began to crumble. The cult's forces, once united in their dark purpose, scattered like leaves in a storm, their malevolent cohesion shattered. Amid the chaos, Selene emerged, her eyes scanning the wreckage until they locked onto Kael. Relief and exhaustion mingled in her gaze as she rushed to his side. Their reunion was silent, words unnecessary, a shared glance conveyed everything. The trials they had endured, the sacrifices made, had deepened their bond in ways neither could have imagined. Together, they stood amidst the ruins, their hearts heavy with the weight of loss. Fallen allies, brave souls who had stood with them until the end, were mourned, their memories a bittersweet reminder of the cost of victory. As the days passed, signs of healing began to emerge. The land, once poisoned by the cult's influence, slowly began to recover. Crops sprouted anew, and the air grew cleaner, lighter. Yet Kael knew that some wounds ran deeper than the surface. The scars of his journey, both physical and emotional, would remain, a constant reminder of the darkness he had faced and the light he had fought to preserve. Still, he found solace in the knowledge that the world was safe, at least for now, and as the sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light over the recovering land, Kael and Selene turned their eyes to the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, side by side. As Kael and Selene stepped through the ancient archways of the sanctuary, the air seemed to hum with a newfound energy. The once quiet halls now echoed with the murmurs of mages and apprentices, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Kael, the man who had once been feared as the Dark Sorcerer, now stood in the center of the room, his presence met with cheers rather than whispers of dread. It was a moment he could scarcely believe, a hero's welcome for someone who had once strayed so far from the light. Selene watched him with a quiet smile, her gaze steady and encouraging. She could see the weight of his journey etched into his expression, the memories of past mistakes flickering in his eyes. Kael turned to her, his voice low but sincere. "I never thought I'd see this day," he admitted. "I've made so many wrong choices, hurt so many people. How can they look at me like this after everything I've done?" Selene placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch a grounding force. "You've changed, Kael. That's what matters. You faced your darkness and chose to fight for something greater. That's why they see you as a hero, not because you're perfect, but because you're trying to be better, and that's something worth celebrating." Her words struck a chord, and Kael felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift, if only slightly. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "You're right. I can't undo the past, but I can choose what I do with the future. I won't let my magic be a weapon of destruction again. I'll use it to protect, to heal, to rebuild." With Selene by his side, Kael began the daunting task of restoring the Mage Order. Together, they worked to gather the scattered remnants of their community, reaching out to those who had fled or gone into hiding. It was a slow process, filled with challenges and setbacks, but Kael approached it with a determination that surprised even himself. As they worked, Selene's unwavering support became his anchor. She reminded him of the importance of their mission, not just for themselves, but for the world. The Mage Order has always been about balance, she told him one evening as they pored over ancient texts. It's not just about wielding power, it's about understanding it, respecting it, and using it to safeguard the world from those who would exploit it. Kael listened intently, her words guiding him like a beacon. He realized that his journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about creating a legacy. A legacy that would ensure no one else would follow the path he once had. And so, as the days turned into weeks, Kael and Selene laid the foundation for a new era. A Mage Order built not on fear or dominance, but on unity and purpose. Kael's magic, once a force of chaos, now became a tool for creation. Together, they trained new apprentices, forged alliances, and fortified the sanctuary against future threats. It wasn't an easy path, and Kael knew there would always be those who doubted him. But with Selene's faith in him and his own growing resolve, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. His journey of redemption had only just begun, but for the first time in a long time, Kael felt a sense of hope, a belief that he could truly make amends and build a brighter future for them all. Kael stood on the edge of the cliff, the salty breeze brushing against his face as he gazed out at the endless expanse of the sea. The Tome, once a source of unimaginable power and peril, was now nothing more than ashes scattered to the wind. Its destruction marked the end of an era, a chapter of chaos and darkness that had threatened to consume everything. Yet, as the waves crashed against the rocks below, Kael couldn't help but feel the heaviness of the choices he'd made. Each decision had come at a cost, but they had also paved the way for something new. Selene approached quietly, her presence a comforting reminder that he wasn't alone. Together, they had faced the unimaginable, and now they stood at the precipice of a future they had fought so hard to secure. The Dark Sorcerer's legacy is gone, she said, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of their shared journey. But the world will always need guardians. Balance isn't something you achieve once. It's something you fight for every day. Kael nodded, his thoughts turning to the next generation. We've seen what happens when power falls into the wrong hands. It's our duty to ensure that those who come after us understand the responsibility that comes with magic. They need to know that it's not just about strength, it's about purpose, about protecting the fragile harmony of this world. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the horizon stretching out before them as the first rays of sunlight began to break through the darkness. The rising sun seemed to symbolize more than just a new day. It was a testament to the hope they had kindled through their sacrifices. The world had been changed forever, shaped by their courage and determination. As they turned to leave, Kael couldn't help but glance back one last time. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also revealed the strength of those who fought for what was right. Though the battle was over, he knew the war for balance would never truly end. And as the light of dawn bathed the land, he felt a quiet resolve settle within him. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility, a canvas waiting to be painted by the hands of those who dared to believe in a better world.